You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a PhD-holding historian, a professor, and the creator of History That Doesn't Suck, a podcast that makes legit, seriously researched American history come to life through entertaining stories. Join me for a chronological telling of the United States story, from the Revolution to fractious Civil War, tenacious inventors, brave reformers, and more. With more than 100 episodes, you can already binge listen your way from 1776 to the early 20th century. Listen to History That Doesn't Suck on Spotify.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 55th episode of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast. At the end of the last show, the Union Army was finally ready to march from Centreville and turn the Confederates' left flank. Johnston's men had left the Shenandoah and had started to roll into Manassas Junction, and Beauregard was still cherishing plans of taking the offensive and turning the tables on McDowell.
Many years later, Beauregard would recall that, quote, the political hostilities of a generation were now face to face with weapons instead of words. Defeat to either side would be a deep mortification, but defeat to the South must turn its claim of independence into an empty boast. Sunday, July 21st, bearing the fate of the newborn Confederacy, broke brightly over the fields and woods that held the hostile forces. End quote.
People back in the Civil War era used the phrase "to see the elephant" to describe having been through some memorable experience. Soldiers who had fought in the Mexican War used the phrase. After experiencing combat, they would say, "I have seen the elephant." 49ers, after arriving in the far-off gold fields, used the expression to describe having made the long and arduous journey to California. And during the earliest days of the Civil War, the volunteers of both sides, North and South, sat around campfires wondering what it would be like to be in battle, wondering what it would be like to see the elephant.
Those hostile forces that P.G.T. Beauregard spoke of in the fields and woods on both sides of the stream known as Bull Run, those hostile forces were mostly made up of untried, untested citizen soldiers, most of whom were still little more than boys. Most of them were farm boys, or from small towns or rural villages, and up to this point in their lives, they had had little exposure to the world and its ways. And so going off to war was an exciting adventure. Most all of them were brimming with enthusiasm and totally lacking in experience. Sunday, July 21st, 1861, broke brightly over the fields and woods that held the hostile forces of two inexperienced armies. Before the sun sets on this awful day, hundreds of those boys will be dead, and many more will be wounded, some crippled for life. They will have fought the war's first big battle. They will have seen the elephant.
Irvin McDowell's 35,000-man army stirred to life well before first light on Sunday, July 21st. During the 2 days that Major Barnard had hunted for a crossing north of the Stone Bridge, the Federal camps around Centreville had hummed with activity and excitement as the army prepared itself for the upcoming battle. And now, in the darkness before dawn on this Sabbath morning, McDowell's force finally lurched into motion.
As we said previously, McDowell planned to have a good part of his army march north and cross Bull Run by means of Sudley Ford and another smaller ford that were upstream of the Stone Bridge. The Stone Bridge, which carried the Warrenton Turnpike across the run, marked the end of Beauregard's 8-mile-long defensive line, and so once the Federal soldiers crossed Bull Run to the north of the bridge, they would have turned the Confederates' left flank and could plunge into the enemy's rear, rolling up the Confederate line from north to south and winning the battle. The two Federal divisions tasked with this turning movement belonged to David Hunter and Samuel Heintzelman.
While Hunter and Heintzelman turned the Confederates' left flank, McDowell wanted most of Daniel Tyler's division to make a demonstration at the Stone Bridge, and then farther downstream, another diversion would be created at Mitchell's Ford by Richardson's brigade.
In the pre-dawn darkness, almost as soon as the Union Army started to move out from its camps, a massive traffic jam snarled the line of march. Tyler's division, in the lead, took hours to get down the Warrenton Turnpike, stalling Hunter's and Heintzelman's divisions, which for some inexplicable reason had been placed in line behind it. Efficient staff work would have allowed for Hunter and Heintzelman to take the lead, and only after they turned north off the turnpike on their march to Sudley Ford would then have Tyler's force proceeded down the road to the stone bridge. As it was, the poor planning and the resulting delay caused by the three-division traffic jam meant that McDowell's plan, which depended on speed, started to unravel almost from the get-go.
When the 13,000 men of Hunter's and Heintzelman's divisions finally were able to turn north off the pike, they were slowed again by the farm road leading to Sudley Ford, which turned out to be a barely passable cart path. Y'all will recall from the last episode that Bernard's scouting of the route to Sudley Ford had been incomplete due to the fact that he turned around after running into some Confederate cavalry. So although Bernard had told McDowell that the ford and its approach were suitable for the Army's movement, that was really just a guess, since he had never completed his reconnaissance.
Well, Bernard's guess turned out to be wrong, and so McDowell's plan, which remember depended on speed, unraveled even further. The distance to Sudley was actually 4 miles farther than Bernard estimated, and so some of the Union soldiers would be marching 12 or 13 miles before even beginning to fight. And the march was not easy. The farm road the Federals took was in reality a narrow, twisting path, often through heavy woods. And to make matters worse, the Confederates had made the journey even more difficult by hastily felling trees across the trail. Augustus Woodbury, chaplain of the 2nd Rhode Island of Burnside's brigade, which was leading the turning movement, recalled, quote, "What a toilsome march it was through the woods! What wearisome work in clearing away the fallen trees, which now and then obstructed the path! The 2nd Regiment led the van, with skirmishers well thrown out on either side. The artillery could be moved, but with difficulty. Colonel Hunter, who was lame, proceeded in a carriage. Other vehicles were along, with civilians who wished to see the battle. The march was necessarily slow, and it was not till 9 o'clock that the head of the column emerged from the woods and came out upon a relatively good farm road, along which were scattered a few comfortable-looking houses about a mile from Sudley Ford. The inhabitants of the neighborhood were out, dressed in their Sunday clothes, apparently preparing to go to church. But the little building, which has become historical as Sudley Church, was to witness no worship on that day. By the time usually assigned for the beginning of the service, it had become a hospital and was filled with wounded and dying men." End quote.
According to McDowell's plan, the flanking column was to cross Bull Run at Sudley at 7 a.m., but the maddeningly slow pace of the march meant that at the appointed hour, Hunter's and Heintzelman's divisions were still making their fitful way toward the ford. While the flanking column was making its slow way toward Sudley Ford, the rest of the Federal Army prepared to demonstrate along the lower crossings of Bull Run. For his part, Tyler managed to arrive in front of the stone bridge only an hour late. As Tyler's command reached the ridge overlooking Bull Run, about a mile from the stream, Robert Shanks and William T. Sherman's brigades deployed astride the turnpike. Since Tyler was there at the stone bridge only to threaten, not to do battle, he decided that was something he could do as well with cannon, so he positioned Shanks and Sherman's infantry, but then deployed his artillery. Most conspicuous among that artillery was a piece commanded by Lieutenant Peter C. Haynes. It was a massive 3-ton Parrott rifle that threw a 30-pound shell. Appropriately, Tyler chose Haynes's big gun to fire the first shot of the battle.
Haynes' 30-pounder Parrott was the largest piece of ordnance on the battlefield. It was really a siege gun, not a piece of field artillery, and it had required a Herculean effort just to get it to Bull Run. Haynes later recalled, quote, "I well remember how the men loved that huge gun. It was amazing. The piece weighed 6,000 pounds, The shot was more than 4 inches in diameter and over a foot in length, weighing about 33 pounds. When one remembers the crudeness of artillery at that time, it is wonderful how accurately we could shoot with such a gun at a range of a mile or more. The men had great confidence in it. I have seen them come up to it and pat its breech affectionately. "Good old boy, you'll make 'em sit up. Just wait a bit," they would say. They had an idea that that gun would win the cause of the Union, and how they struggled with it on the hard places. It was all very human, very touching, and after all these years the memory of it almost brings tears." End quote. Indeed, as Haines said, they struggled with the enormous gun on the hard places. Along the line of march into northeastern Virginia, besides the 10 horses assigned to pull the piece, 200 men would often be straining on ropes, and still, uphills with the 6,000-pound cannon were back-breaking effort, and downhills were high-speed adventures. After all that, aside from signaling the start of the action, and then firing a few more shells, the big gun mostly just sat in place all day, and was eventually captured there by the Confederates at the end of the battle.
But at about 6 a.m., as the sun rose in the morning sky, Haines manhandled his beloved gun into place on the Warrenton Turnpike, about a mile from the stone bridge, and sent a massive shell screaming across the stream. With that shot, the First Battle of Manassas was underway.
On the other side of Bull Run that morning, defending the stone bridge and on the receiving end of Haines' shells, was the small command of 37-year-old Colonel Nathan G. Evans. In his book, Donnybrook, The Battle of Bull Run, 1861, David Detzer explains that, quote, "When Nathan George Evans had been a student at West Point, his fellow cadets, searching for an appropriate nickname, looked at his scrawny legs and found their answer. From that time on, they called him Shanks. He stood third from the bottom of his class. Born in South Carolina, Evans graduated a few months too late to participate in the Mexican War. He spent most of the next 13 years in the West, exploring the land and contending with Comanche warriors. He developed a reputation in the small fraternity of America's Army officers as being not very bright, but contentious and tough, a fierce fighter. One of his classmates considered him a rude brawler and said he was insubordinate, gruff, rough-hewn, and intemperate." End quote. On the morning of July 21, 1861, it was the Confederacy's great good fortune that the officer defending the northern end of Beauregard's line was Evans, for what would be needed there in the next few crucial hours was a fierce and bold fighter. And fortunately for the South, that description fit Shanks Evans to a T.
After the opening shot by Haines' massive cannon, Tyler's Federals and Evans' Confederates spent the next 2 hours engaging in some half-hearted skirmishing, punctuated occasionally by the boom of Union artillery. But since the Federal soldiers weren't pressing forward, Evans kept back most of his men. And at 8 a.m., as the fighting, such as it was, extended into its third hour, it became apparent to Evans that the Yankees had no intention of forcing a crossing at the stone bridge. Although the Northerners across the way outnumbered him badly, Evans was beginning to suspect that the action at the bridge was just so much play acting. But that raised the question, if the main Federal attack would not be made at the stone bridge, then where would it fall?
One advantage that Evans had over most of his fellow commanders on the Bull Run line was the signal station that was located at his headquarters on the farm of Abraham Van Pelt. Using that station, Evans could communicate quickly with the 2 other signal stations that had been positioned at McLean's farm and at Wilcoxon's Hill near Union Mills, 8 miles away.
Those signal stations were platforms built on natural high points, and the system was based on the concept of Samuel Morse's telegraph. But they used cloth attached to long poles and waggled right or left in certain patterns. Waving a flag 3 times to the left meant one thing, twice to the right plus once to the left meant another, and so on. Once you learned the system's alphabet, you could even use torches at night.
Exactly. And one of Beauregard's staff officers, a 26-year-old Georgian, Captain E. Porter Alexander, had set up those signal stations along the Bull Run line, and on the morning of July 21st, he was posted at the one down at Wilcoxon's Hill. Alexander later recalled, quote, "The Federals had brought on a very heavy gun for field service, a 30-pound Parrott rifle they called Long Tom. Long Tom was on the pike opposite the stone bridge, and opened the day with a shot at my little signal station near the stone bridge, and the shot went through the tent but hurt nobody. Everywhere else, things were quiet. I exchanged messages with all the stations when I got on Wilcoxon's Hill, and then fixed my glass on the stone bridge station looking for the earliest developments there. And while looking at them, as well as I remember about 8:30 a.m., suddenly a little flash of light in the same field of view, but far beyond them, caught my eye. I was looking to the west, and the sun was low in the east, and this flash was the reflection of the sun from a brass cannon in McDowell's flanking column approaching Sudley Ford. It was about 8 miles from me, and was but a faint gleam, but I had a fine glass and well-trained eyes, and I knew at once what it was. And careful observation also detected the glitter of bayonets all along a road crossing the valley, and I felt sure that I was on to McDowell's plan and saw it was the best part of his army. First I signaled to Evans, as of most immediate consequence, 'Look out for your left, you are flanked,' and then wrote a note for General Beauregard by courier as he was not near a station." End quote.
Captain Alexander's sharp eyes had detected the Union flanking march, and he alertly signaled to Evans at the stone bridge that his left was in danger. Hesitation would probably have meant disaster for the Confederate Army, but Evans responded quickly. In doing so, he realized the advantages of not fully committing his command to respond to Tyler's demonstration, because although Evans now moved off with most of his men and only left a skeleton force to defend the stone bridge, the Federals across Bull Run didn't even notice what had happened. As David Detzer tells it, quote, "Shanks Evans had to make a decision, and quickly. The steps he took were remarkable in their audacity. He had already concluded that Tyler's relative inaction meant that the Yankees just across Bull Run were not intent on an immediate assault on this spot. He notified Koch, his nominal superior, that he was moving away from the stone bridge. To keep watch on the bridge, he left the 4 forward companies of the 4th South Carolina and took the rest of his little army with him, 2 guns and about 800 men. Shanks Evans had no idea how many of the enemy were on their way from Sudley Ford, but he intended to try to stop them, or at least slow them down. It was an amazing gamble. On the far side of the stone bridge, Tyler had 2 brigades, almost 7,000 men. If Tyler suddenly decided to cross Bull Run, the only thing now standing between him and Manassas Junction were 200 South Carolina infantrymen." End quote.
Most of the fighting during the battle would take place south of Sudley Ford, along the Manassas-Sudley Road. 2 hills along the road, about 1.5 miles apart, will become the focus of the bitterest combat. At Manassas, like at most Civil War battles, much of the fighting will take place on someone's farmland. A farm is usually near at least one good road, and then the fields or orchards on a farm are open land, across which infantry formations can maneuver, and that permit the movement and use of artillery.
At Manassas, while the combat took place on open farmland, the fighting was actually for control of those 2 hills that Rich mentioned. And this was true on almost all battlefields. The soldiers would fight for control of some terrain feature, such as a hill, ridge, woods, buildings, bridge, or crossroads, because it would give them a tactical advantage. In other words, it was important because it would improve the defense of a position or would smooth the progress of an attack. On the battlefield at Manassas, south of the Sudley Ford, was a farm owned by the Matthews brothers, Edgar, Carson, and Martin. The farmhouse was a small, 1-story, white wooden structure. Around the house were the usual farm outbuildings and rail fences. Fields of hay and corn stretched away from the buildings, and there was one large clump of trees a bit to the east. Locals called the high ground north of the house Matthews Hill.
The division passed the ford slowly, for the day had become very warm, and the horses and men were thirsty. General McDowell and his staff came riding up in haste, saying, as he passed Colonel Burnside, "The enemy is moving heavy columns from Manassas." The men at once quickened their steps. Colonel Hunter, with Slocum and the 2nd Regiment, hurried forward, rounded a small piece of forest that concealed the crest of the hill above the Warrenton Turnpike, and came out upon an open field beyond. Upon the left of this open space was a small house with outbuildings belonging to a man named Matthews. Sloping down to a piece of woods in front was a large cornfield. The plateau upon which the column emerged was an admirable position and commanded a wide and pleasant prospect. Chaplain Augustus Woodbury, 2nd Rhode Island, Burnside's brigade.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I'd like to call redacted history. I believe that all history, no matter how good or bad, needs to be told. There are wars, massacres, battles, and entire historical events that are just not in our school's history books. Have you ever heard of Mary Bowser? I didn't think so. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. So come huddle around the campfire with me and get ready to hear the stories that you were robbed of. And get comfortable. We're going to be here a while. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Hey y'all, spooky season is here. And if you're looking for a show to whet your appetite for a little haunted history, then I'd like to invite you to check out Southern Gothic, a chart-topping history podcast that explores some of the most infamous legends, folklore, ghost stories, and hauntings of the American South. We've covered all sorts of stuff from the Bell Witch of Tennessee to the disappearance of the Confederate submarine, the H.L. Hunley, not to mention our deep dives into the local lore of some of America's oldest and most haunted cities, like New Orleans, Charleston, and St. Augustine. So, if you're ready for a little good old-fashioned Halloween storytelling with a commitment to quality historical research, then be sure to check out Southern Gothic today. It's available now on all your favorite podcast apps.
It was 9:30, 2.5 hours behind schedule, when Hunter's column reached Sudley Ford. During the meandering approach march, as the sun had risen higher in the morning sky, the Union soldiers, in their wool uniforms and weighted down with their rifles and assorted equipment, about 40 pounds in all, they started to suffer terribly from the heat. When Hunter's leading brigade, commanded by Ambrose Burnside, finally reached the ford, they were racked by thirst and swarmed into the stream. They churned up the water so that the troops following behind them found to their dismay that they were unable to fill their canteens in the muddy ooze. From the ford, the Manassas-Sudley road led directly south. About 3 miles away, it intersected with the Warrenton Turnpike. Past that crossroads, the road continued south for 3 miles to Manassas Junction. But between the ford and the intersection with the Warrenton Turnpike, the road crossed first Matthews Hill and then Henry Hill. Due to the fateful delay in the march of the Federal flanking column, and thanks to E. Porter Alexander's warning, Shanks Evans was given time to rush over from the stone bridge and intercept the advancing Yankees. It was at Matthews Hill that Evans' Confederates would meet the enemy.
Shortly before McDowell arrived on the scene, it was actually a couple of officers with the weary and parched Federal column who rode south from the ford on the Manassas-Sudley Road and discovered that the flanking movement had been found out and a Confederate force was marching to intercept them. That startling news led Hunter to quickly order an end to the brief siesta at the ford, and he told Burnside to move out immediately with the 2nd Rhode Island in the lead. The Rhode Islanders were followed by the 6-gun battery of Captain William Reynolds. The battery consisted of half a dozen 13-pounder James rifles. Lieutenant J. Albert Monroe, the battery's second in command, described his unit's rush southward to gain the critical heights of Matthews Hill. Quote, General Hunter's column, to which Colonel Burnside's brigade was attached, was the right of the advancing line, and soon after sunrise, the report of heavy guns to the left told us that the work of the day had commenced.
That was Tyler's artillery over at the Stone Bridge.
Right, but Monroe's account continues. Steadily, however, the column pushed on, but with frequent halts, until Sudley Church was reached, where a short stop was made in the shade of the thick foliage of the trees in the vicinity of the church. The battery was following the 2nd Rhode Island, a portion of which were deployed as skirmishers. Suddenly the outposts of the enemy opened fire, which to our inexperienced ears sounded like the explosion of several bunches of firecrackers. Immediately after came the order, "Forward your battery!" With most commendable promptness, but without that caution which a battery commander learns to observe only by experience, Captain Reynolds rushed his battery forward at once at a sharp gallop. The road at this point was skirted by woods, but a short distance beyond, the battery emerged upon an open field, and at once went into position and opened fire. The battery was now considerably in advance of the infantry, and could easily have been captured before the supporting infantry were formed in line of battle. And 2 years later, under the same circumstances, the entire battery would have been lost. But at this time neither side hardly understood the rudiments of the art of war. When we reached the open field, the air seemed to be filled with myriads of serpents, such was the sound of the bullets passing through it. Above us and around us on every side they seemed to be hissing, writhing, and twisting. I have been under many a hot fire, but I don't think that in nearly 4 years' experience I ever heard so many bullets in such a short space of time. End quote.
As the 2nd Rhode Island and Reynolds Battery crested Matthews Hill, they were met by a severe fire thrown up by Shanks Evans' 2 cannon and 800 or so feisty Confederate infantry. Evans, in moving his small command to block the Yankees, had not actually occupied the top of the hill, but instead his men took position on the southern slope, about 250 yards from the summit. Private Sam English of the 2nd Rhode Island remembered that, quote, a perfect hailstorm of bullets, round shot, and shell was poured into us, tearing through the ranks and scattering death and confusion everywhere. End quote. Though a bit unsettled by being under fire for the first time, the New Englanders managed to shake themselves out into line and return the fire of the rebels down the slope. It was at this time that Colonel John S. Slocum, leading the 2nd Rhode Island, was mortally wounded. A rebel bullet slammed into Slocum's head as he was climbing over a rail fence. Private Eben Gordon recalled, quote, soon the order was given, forward 2nd Rhode Island. The order was obeyed with alacrity, our men shouting like so many fiends, and we rushed wildly and impetuously through the woods, over a fence, and then we found we were rather mixed up. But we did not mind it, and immediately commenced firing without the order to fire, and so briskly was it kept up that the enemy soon ceased fire, leaving the cornfield between us, and started for their batteries and their companions in the woods. About this time our gallant colonel received his death wound. This, however, did not stop the almost mad career of our men. They continued with hardly a moment's cessation until the enemy started from the woods which sheltered them. At one time the order was given to cease firing. I was ordered by Captain Vile to assist in picking up our wounded comrades. The first I came to was one of my own mess, James McCabe, wounded in the right leg just below the hip, the ball passing entirely through his leg. The brave fellow, after I got assistance to take him from the field, fairly begged us to leave him and go back and fight. Finally, we left him in the surgeon's care, he bidding me goodbye, telling me to remember him, but not to come to him until we had whipped the rebels. Poor brave fellow, he was loved by all his messmates, and we speak often of him. End quote.
The 2nd Rhode Island and Reynolds' half-dozen guns up on Matthews Hill were left alone to brave the enemy fire for far too long because Hunter badly botched the deployment of his division, and as a result the rest of Burnside's brigade stood by, undeployed, while up on the hill their comrades traded volleys with the Confederates. To make matters worse, although Burnside's unemployed men were closest to the firing line, Hunter ordered Colonel Andrew Porter to take his brigade past them onto the field to assist the 2nd Rhode Island in the battery. But Porter misunderstood this confusing order, and instead of moving all the way up to the firing line, he positioned his brigade behind Burnside's idle troops. As a result of Hunter's mismanagement, Reynolds' guns and the solitary regiment of Rhode Islanders fought alone on Matthews Hill for at least half an hour, despite the fact that 4,500 of their comrades were nearby. If Hunter had had his act together, his division could have easily brushed aside Shanks-Evans' small force of Confederates and then pushed on south on the Manassas-Sudley Road. Luckily for the Union cause, Hunter was then wounded, and as he was evacuated from the field, he passed command of his division and of the fight at Matthews Hill to Colonel Ambrose Burnside. But, unfortunately for the Union cause, by that point, Evans' small, feisty blocking force had bought enough time that rebel reinforcements were arriving on the scene.
As we mentioned a few minutes ago, when Evans rushed his small force over from the Stone Bridge, intent on blocking or at least delaying the surprise Union flanking movement, he positioned his men at Matthews Hill on the Manassas-Sudley Road. In his book, The First Battle of Manassas, An End to Innocence, John Hennessy explains that, quote, "The position Evans took was an odd one. Matthews Hill was in fact not a hill at all, but rather a high point on one of the many generally north-south ridges that roughen the area. Still, it was the only significant geographic feature between Sudley and the Warrenton Turnpike, and if properly manned, highly defensible. But Evans did not occupy the crest of the hill. Instead, his command took position on its southern slope. Perhaps it was a position calculated for surprise or for the security of his small, untried command. Certainly it was not the position of strength. Directly in front, the Federals would hold ground 30 feet higher than his own, so too on the left, on what was styled locally as Dogan's Ridge, where the high ground angled inconveniently around Evans' flank. Only hard fighting that begot time enough for reinforcements to arrive would allow Nathan Evans to hold this position." End quote.
Evans had 2 guns of the Lynchburg artillery with him and 800 or 900 infantry, Louisianans and South Carolinians. A friendly fire incident took place when the South Carolinians, moving through woods, opened fire on some shadowy figures in front of them. They turned out to be the Louisianans, who were known as Wheat's Tigers, since they were commanded by the colorful Roberdeau Wheat. As they took fire from their comrades to the rear, the tough Louisianans, recruited from the Boweries and wharves of New Orleans, simply turned around and fired right back at the South Carolinians. Well, the South Carolinians got the message, and after that unfortunate affair was sorted out, Evans' command finished its deployment, and by 9:30 the Confederates were ready.
That friendly fire incident was due to the inexperience and nervousness of the Southern soldiers, but also to the fact that Evans' 2 infantry units wore different uniforms. And over the next few hours, telling friend from foe would prove to be a confusing, sometimes deadly problem for both sides. That's because at this early stage in the war, units on both sides still wore a bewildering variety of uniforms. In 1861, some Southerners wore blue, while some Northerners wore gray uniforms, since before the war, gray was a popular color in which to outfit local militia units. The result was that in some early battles, like here at Manassas, both sides had men dressed in shades of blue and gray.
Flags should have helped identify friend from foe, but on July 21st, the air here on the battlefield was almost unnaturally still, without even the hint of a breeze throughout most of this hot and muggy day. And so regimental flags and national colors hung limp on their poles, and were often little help in telling who was who. This was especially true after a considerable amount of smoke had been generated by musketry and cannon fire, and with the air so still, the smoke simply hung close to the ground like a fog, obscuring vision.
So just keep in mind that for all those reasons, telling friend from foe on the battlefield will sometimes prove to be quite a problem for both sides over the next few hours.
And then the oppressive heat and humidity of this July day will also prove to be a problem for the men, as both sides rush troops to the sound of the guns. Confederates and Yankees will become desperately thirsty as the battle rages, and many will suffer from heat stroke. This will be especially true among some of the Federal units, which, as we mentioned before, had to march well over 10 miles just to reach Sudley Ford. Once the fighting at Matthews Hill and then Henry Hill started to rage, some northern and southern units practically jogged the last portion of the march, and so those formations arrived at the scene of the fighting not only exhausted and dehydrated, but some Federal units especially also arrived on the field well under strength, since in some cases nearly half of their men had dropped out along the way because of the heat.
But anyway, to get back to the action. As Evans and his small force battled the head of the Federal flanking column, the reinforcements he so desperately needed began to arrive nearby. Brigadier General Barnard B., leading Joseph E. Johnston's 3rd Brigade, had arrived by train from the Shenandoah with a portion of his command the day before, Saturday, July 20th. After getting off the train and marching up to the Bull Run line, B's men had originally been placed behind the Confederate center, and that was just fine with B, since that was where the hardest fighting was expected to take place. But then on this Sunday morning, with the battle brewing, he had been told to take his command north to the Stone Bridge, and B had grumbled at the order, fearing it meant his men were marching away from the spot where the fighting would take place.
But as B's command neared the Stone Bridge, he received word of the Federal flanking attempt. Realizing this was a moment of crisis, B immediately decided to divert his force to the left, toward the old Widow Henry's farm. Driven by a chance to have a go at the Yankees, B's men hustled, quote, through pine thickets and cedar hammocks, over ditches, gullies, and briar patches, fences, swamps, hills, and valleys, end quote, and didn't stop until they reached Henry Hill. There, as the first rattling musketry and booming of artillery came from Matthews Hill, B's force, which also included men from Colonel Francis Bartow's 2nd Brigade, formed up around Mrs. Henry's house on the northern edge of Henry Hill. This was about 700 yards behind Evans' line on Matthews Hill. B and Bartow had brought up the 4th Alabama, 11th Mississippi, and 7th and 8th Georgia. After placing those regiments, B went looking for some guns to support his position, and he quickly rounded up the 4-gun battery of John Imboden. As Hennessy tells it in his book, quote, B bade Imboden to follow him, and the cavalcade dashed toward Henry Hill. B guided Imboden to his position, and the Virginian unlimbered his 4 6-pounder guns near B's command on the northern edge of the hill. In the distance, separated from them by the valley of Young's Branch and the Warrenton Turnpike, B, Imboden, and their men could see Evans' 900 men in position on the southern slope of Matthews Hill, white smoke marking the battle's first serious volleys. Clearly happy that he would not miss the battle after all, B exclaimed to Imboden, "Here's the battlefield, and we are in for it." End quote.
Up on Matthews Hill, as his Louisianians and South Carolinians blazed away at the Yankees along a 300-yard front, Shanks Evans sensed that without substantial reinforcements, his small force would soon be overwhelmed by the Federals' greater numbers. And so Evans rode back to B's position on Henry Hill and asked for help. B, having watched the fighting from afar, could see that Evans' position on the southern slope of Matthews Hill left much to be desired, so he suggested Evans withdraw and join him on Henry Hill. But Evans' blood was up, and he brushed aside B's suggestion. Evans said he could hold his ground if he could get help. Persuaded by Evans' determination, B gave in. He went over to the 4th Alabama, commanded by Colonel Egbert Jones. While waving his hand toward the battle raging across the valley, B yelled, "Up, Alabamians!"
It was just before 11 a.m. when B rode up to the 4th Alabama and ordered them to enter the fray. And by then, Evans' embattled little force on Matthews Hill badly needed the help. In a desperate attempt to hold off the Yankees, Wheat's Tigers had charged Reynolds' guns. But as the Louisianans surged forward toward the Federal cannon, the 1st Rhode Island arrived on the line, and their fire shattered the Confederates' advance. As Ethan Rafuse, in his book A Single Grand Victory, tells it, quote, "Among those to fall was Major Wheat, who was hit by a Federal ball that entered under his armpit, went through his chest, and exited the other side of his body. Wheat would, to the surprise of many, including the doctor who first reached him, recover from his wound. When told by a surgeon that his wound was fatal, Wheat replied, 'I don't feel like dying yet.' The doctor then informed him, 'There's no instance on record of recovery from such a wound.' To this, Wheat replied, 'Well then, I will put my case on record.'" End quote.
The Alabamans led the way as Bee and Bartow took 3 regiments, the 4th Alabama, 2nd Mississippi, and 8th Georgia, up the slope of Matthews Hill to reinforce Shanks Evans' embattled little force. Private George S. Barnsley of the 8th Georgia recalled seeing Colonel Bartow riding back and forth, despite the rain of shells from the Federal battery on Matthews Hill. Quote, "Our colonel rode along in front on a beautiful white horse. He rode up and down leisurely in front, as if he wished to find out what a Yankee battery meant by shelling us, and that he was not afraid. Several shells burst over and around us, and pieces knocked up dirt. I was thinking of what my father had written to me, to bear in mind the old saying, to keep your powder dry and trust in the Lord, when one of those shells fell close to me, burying the ground, and when exploding, leaving a good-sized hole. For a few minutes, I confess that I did wish that I was a ground squirrel or a possum so that I could get into that hole. The colonel did not think, evidently, that we could take that battery of 6 guns in the front, and so we went down the hill and across a field with a rail fence in the middle, and another at the edge of a thicket of young pines and blackberry bushes. Company A was at the head of the regiment, and I was among the first ranks. We were rushing up the side of an old wash, and it was rather steep. I remember being much amused as Schofield, who was in the rank ahead of me. In the rush, I stepped twice on the heel of his shoes. He became angry, and still advancing, turned his head and shouted to me that if I trod on his heels again, he would knock me down with the butt of his gun. It struck me as comical when we were going into what was expected to be wounds or death." End quote.
The fighting on Matthews Hill grew fierce as Bee's reinforcements came up to support Evans, and perhaps 3,300 Confederates now aggressively confronted the Yankee thrust. But fresh Federals countered the rebel buildup as Ambrose Burnside fed more regiments into the battle line. Heintzelman's division also began to arrive at Sudley Ford, and its units rushed southward toward the sound of the firing. On Matthews Hill, the two sides blazed away at one another along a front that had now been extended to 1/4 of a mile in length. As the right side of the reinforced Confederate line began to extend past his own flank, Burnside looked around desperately for more men. He rode over to Colonel Andrew Porter's brigade, which included a battalion of regulars, and exclaimed, "Porter, for God's sake, let me have the regulars. My men are all being cut to pieces."
In an army largely composed of green volunteers, Major George Sykes' battalion of regular infantry was a valuable resource, and so Porter was reluctant to release them, but in the face of Burnside's pleading, he finally relented. Once they were in position, the regulars' fire was at first disappointing, not any better than the volunteers, but Sykes' men quickly settled down and began pouring an effective fire into the front and flank of the Georgians. Within a short time, the steady hail of fire from the regulars began to unravel that end of the Confederate line.
Lieutenant Eugene Carter of the 3rd U.S. Infantry recalled, quote, "We could see the Rhode Island battery firing and see the return shots from the rebel battery. We marched in this direction by 4s and came behind 2 Rhode Island regiments. We met Burnside, and he ran toward us, saying, 'Good God, Major Sykes, you regulars are just what we want. Form on my left and give aid to my men who are being cut to pieces.' We formed on the run, the Rhode Islanders cheering and exciting our men. As soon as we were formed, we commenced firing. Our men fired badly. They were excited, and some of the recruits fired at the stars. We were then wheeled by company to the right, to gain a wood on our right. As we got to the edge of the wood, we observed a white flag upon a sword held by someone lying down. We went to the spot and found Colonel Jones of one of the Alabama regiments mortally wounded. He asked for a drink of water, which we gave him. He asked what we intended to do, and we told him to whip them. He said, "Gentlemen, you have got me, but 100,000 more await you." End quote. But threatened by federal pressure on both flanks, and with no more reinforcements in sight, the Confederates fighting on Matthews Hill began to waver.
About this same time, a brigade from Tyler's division, the one led by William Tecumseh Sherman, crossed Bull Run at a previously unknown ford just above the stone bridge. After crossing the stream, Sherman's men advanced toward the rear of the rebel line on Matthews Hill. Now hammered on all sides, the stubborn Confederates were finally forced to fall back. Evans and Bartow's men retreated first, followed by B's, all scrambling south across the Warrenton Turnpike, then climbing the north slope of Henry Hill. Lieutenant John C. Reed of the 8th Georgia recounted the reluctant withdrawal of his unit back toward the Henry House Hill. Quote, Bartow vociferated to the captain of the Atlanta Grays, "We must get these men out of here." Several times he ordered us to fall back, but I was among those who did not hear. Nothing could be understood in the din to which our ears were so new. On the right of the first platoon, close behind it, I was encouraging some of the men of our company to fire with more coolness. Ransom, one of my men, lying on the ground, was keeping his musket quiet, and with much warmth I asked him why he had ceased to fire. He fired at once, began to load, and shouted to me that he had been obeying orders, and he rolled his eyes in such a manner that I glanced to the left and then to the right. I saw that nearly everybody was going back at about quick time. Of course, I could not stay. I carried off my squad very doggedly. Their sullenness increased mine. At every step, they seemed on the point of rushing back, and some would turn and fire. End quote.
It was about half an hour before noon, and as the rebels fell back, McDowell and his staff galloped among the Federal units, waving their hats and shouting, "Victory! Victory! The day is ours!" And indeed it seemed so, since as the surviving Confederate defenders of Matthews Hill retreated, McDowell had nearly 18,000 men on hand on this part of the field. Looking across to the slopes on Henry Hill, 1.5 miles away, McDowell and his triumphant soldiers could see scattered knots of Southerners, some milling about, others continuing to withdraw out of sight. Some mounted Confederate officers were trying to reestablish order, but not appearing to have much success. The battle for Matthews Hill had been bitter and bloody, but now, to the Federals, the Confederate army, at least what could be seen of it, appeared to have been whipped. But appearances can be deceiving, and that being true, it was also true that the battle was actually far from over. There would be more bitter and bloody fighting on this day, and when it was finally actually over, it would be the Confederates who would be shouting, "Victory, victory, the day is ours."
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is John Hennessy's book, The First Battle of Manassas, An End to Innocence, July 18th to 21st, 1861.
The cover of Hennessy's book says it's part of the Virginia Civil War Battles and Leaders series. And, well, since we really didn't know much about that, we looked it up while finishing this episode, and there are actually 100 titles in the series, although it looked like quite a few of them are out of print. But anyway, if even some of the rest of the series is half as good as the First Battle of Manassas, that would be saying something. Since John Hennessy's book isn't very thick, but it's one of the best, most straightforward battle narratives you'll ever come across. It really deserves to have a spot on your Civil War bookshelf. As always, you can find all of our book recommendations at the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.blogspot.com.
We want to give 2 shout-outs to 2 fellows who have corresponded with us this past week, Jason C. and Don M. We usually hear from quite a few of y'all each week, but this past week Jason was so sweet to encourage us like he did, and then Don made us laugh out loud when we read his email. So thank you so much, guys.
We also want to say thank you to Spiritwood Music for giving us permission to use their song Midnight on the Water as the music at the beginning and end of each episode of the podcast. And Spiritwood actually has some lovely Christmas music, so if you're listening to this show before Christmas and want some beautiful instrumental music for the holiday, you can find their music on iTunes and Amazon.
As we wrap things up, we want to thank y'all for listening to this episode of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. We hope all of y'all have a very Merry Christmas and that you'll join us again next week. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
That means it's time for this.
We marched in this direction by fours and came behind 2 Rhode Island regiments. We met Burnside, and he ran toward us saying, "Huh, good God, Major Sachs! You regulars are just what we want."
What was that?
Huh, good God, y'all.